All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for the 23rd Annual Pennsylvania Abandoned Mine Reclamation Conference. I'd first like to thank our sponsors once again, the Pennsylvania DEP, the Pennsylvania Environmental Digest, Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, the Appalachian Region Independent Power Producers Association, also known as ARIPA, the Pennsylvania Aggregates and Concrete Association, and Pagnotti Enterprises. We ask that participants ask their questions through the Whova Q&A and chat box to the right of the video on the web app and below on the mobile app. The session will conclude in approximately 40 minutes. So again, thank you for joining us. And with that, I'd like to introduce the following presentation. Ryan Ellis, he is the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at the Interstate Mining Compact Commission. The IMCC is a multi-state governmental organization supporting the natural resource and related environmental protection and mine safety and health interests of its member states, including Pennsylvania. And today he will be providing us an update on federal AML-related legislation. So Ryan, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be back with you at the AMR conference. I did participate in a few of these over the years, but the last couple of years I've been in grad school getting a public policy master's. So I'm excited to be back now at IMCC and back in the AML world. And I've definitely come back at an exciting time. I'm sure everybody knows it's kind of a nail biter right now in Congress. It has been for the last month or two. We're all anxiously waiting to see what's going to happen, but and I'll get into that a little bit more in a little while here. But first, I want to do a quick overview of the stuff that I'll be talking about today. So we'll look at several issues in AML policy. Certainly, first and foremost, we'll be talking about reauthorization of the SMACRA Title IV AML fee. And then also this really massive increase in funding for Title IV AML programs that's potentially available through the Bi-Partisan Infrastructure Bill, or BIF. And I will also talk a little bit about the Reclaim Act and AMLER funding, and kind of more generally about how AML fits into a contemporary vision for economic renewal in coalfield communities. And then I also want to spend some time talking about Good Samaritan protections, and finally a little bit on the non-coal side of the AML world. And then at the end, I will take some questions. So jumping right in, I want to start with some background on the reauthorization effort. So IMCC in the States and the Pennsylvania NGOs and many others have been working on getting the AML fee reauthorized for several years now. And what I'm referring to here is there's a fee on coal production in SMACRA, Title IV, and that fee goes to OSM and then comes back to the states, and it supports most of the coal AML work in the United States. And that fee has to be reauthorized every so often, and it has been already reauthorized many times in the past over the last 40 years. And so we have been, again, working over the last several years, and we've made a lot of progress in making sure Congress is aware of the need for this and the importance of AML, and they are well aware of it, and there is bipartisan support for reauthorization. But now things have gotten a little bit stalled due to this drama in Congress with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Build Back Better plan, which again we'll talk about more in a minute. But so the current fee authorization did expire in September of this year. And I think it's too early to worry yet, because we're very confident that reauthorization will happen in this Congress one way or another. And I think it's important to note that even if it were not to be reauthorized soon, the program does still go on as normal after the fee expires. It's just that the funding for the program changes. So basically, if there's no reauthorization, that eventually the unappropriated balance of the AML trust fund will start to be distributed. And there's about $2 billion or so in the trust fund right now, which was allowed to accumulate over time, partially for just this very reason, to allow for funding after the fee expires. And so that money is enough to run the AML programs for many years. So it's just, again, it's important to keep that in mind. But again, the expectation is that we will get reauthorization as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And in the end, I don't think there'll be any funding lost, or at least it will be easy enough to prevent there being any funding loss due to this lapse in fee collection. So to set the stage a little bit more before we get into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and all of that, as I said, there has been good progress made with reauthorization in the last Congress and in this Congress. Last Congress, the House passed a bill from Representative Cartwright, the main feature of which was the reauthorization. And we at IMCC and working with the Pennsylvania NGOs and many others put a lot of work into that. It's certainly our favorite of the bills that's out there. And that bill also contains several other changes to Title IV beyond just the fee reauthorization, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. There were several other bills introduced in addition to the Cartwright bill in this Congress. And there's a bill from Representative Cheney in the House, and then there are bills respectively from Senator Manchin and Senator Barrasso. The Manchin bill was basically just a simple extension for 15 years, the same fee rates. That was really all. The Cheney and Barrasso bills mirrored one another. Not surprising, they're both being from Wyoming. And those bills would do a couple of other things. They would reduce fees by some amount, and then they would also put in place some community reclaimers or CRA Good Samaritan provisions, which we'll talk about later. I think that we were kind of teed up to have a debate play out between those various bills and to reach some kind of compromise on what reauthorization would look like. And I think we were in fairly good position, but that process ended up not actually playing out because those efforts were preempted by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, which I'll turn to now. And that bill, this massive bipartisan infrastructure bill, it is, what as the name describes, included as part of it a simple extension of the fee collection for Title IV funds, and that would be extended for 13 years at 80% of current fee rates. And then, more importantly, that bill includes, I should say, 11.3 roughly $billion for coal AML funding through Title IV. So I want to pause here and just think about for a moment what a huge accomplishment that is in itself, to have this massive amount of funding being considered in a bill like the BIF, a serious bill. If this passes, which we think it will mean a new dawn for the coal AML programs. It's extremely exciting. With coal production falling and expected to continue falling, it was looking like even with reauthorization, the funding for coal AML would just start to dwindle, because when production of coal goes down, the fee receipts go down. So it was really unclear how we were going to fund the rest of this massive inventory of AML problems in places like Pennsylvania and all over the country. But the states and the NGOs have been making the case for the importance of AML, and that was noticed. And now there's funding on the table that represents more than twice what the states have so far gotten in the past 40 years. It's really an incredible amount of money in that context. It comes at a really important time for coalfield communities. I don't have to tell you all how important this kind of work is for communities in places like Pennsylvania. And I think that's a part of the story your NGOs have been so instrumental in telling, is how important AML is to real people and real communities, and how difficult it is to transition economies when the impacts from the previous year of energy development are still very much being felt. So I think it's probably said often at this conference, but I really think it's true that the Pennsylvania NGOs are a special group, and they've definitely been extremely important to this process. And I'm very grateful for that. So, and I think too that, even though things are a little bit up in the air, even if this doesn't pass, as disappointing as that would be, I think it's still a huge win for the AML world just to see this kind of funding being considered. It's a really deep recognition of the need for AML and how important it is. So I don't want to go on this much, but I think it really bodes for the future of the AML program to see Congress recognizing how important it is. So I think it's a time for all of us to really celebrate, even though it's still unclear what's going to happen. So I'll turn to that now, and I don't want to go too deep into this. I think probably a lot of you have been reading about it, but basically, with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the second bill out there, the Build Back Better reconciliation bill, the Democrats have been struggling to agree on how to pursue their agenda domestically, and so the BIF has broad bipartisan support. It was sent over to the House from the Senate. And I think the Democrats in the House all support it, but can't agree on how exactly it should look. And so the progressives in the House have held back their voting support because they want to wrangle the moderates and people who are skeptical of the larger bill into supporting it if they want to get the infrastructure bill. And then meanwhile, the moderates have been pushing for a separate vote for the BIF and really want to see that decoupled from the Build Back Better, the larger bill. And are skeptical of the price tag and some of the contents of it. Famously, it's Senators Manchin and Sinema, especially, that have said they won't support the Build Back Better bill unless the dollar figure is brought down and there are some changes made substantively. So it's been very dramatic. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, decided to keep the bills together, and there was a September deadline that came and went. Now we're hoping to see something happen here at the end of October. And I think, the latest I've read, just as early as this morning, was that there has been some progress made this week in coming to a compromise. It's still, I think, not clear. There's still some things hanging out there that haven't been agreed upon. So it's possible we see it this week. I think right now, our ultimate expectation, at least at IMCC, and I think others share it, is that the Democrats will eventually come to some kind of compromise on this. It's just too important for them not to come to a compromise, so they can't let this fall apart. But it is possible that it takes significantly longer. It could, I think, go as long as into December for it to finally come together. So they'll probably still, keep being dramatic for now. But again, the future does look bright one way or another. And I think what we can productively talk about now is what happens in either case, whether the BIF passes or fails in the short term. And I'll turn to that now. So I think if the infrastructure bill, the BIF, does not pass, it will mean basically two things for our AML funding effort. The first is that we'll move back into looking at reauthorizing the fee as we were before. So we'll try to get the Cartwright bill and the Manchin, Barrasso, and Cheney bill in conversation with one another and look for a compromise, which, and that process never quite resolved before, as we said. And I think secondly, if it doesn't pass, there will be efforts to see some kind of other Treasury funding added into the mix for what Congress does on coal AML. Because there's been a really good precedent set now to have this huge chunk of funding in the BIF, and even if we were to get a lot less than 11.3 billion, it would still be very, very impactful to get Treasury funding. So I think we're in good position to ask for that. And then if the BIF does pass, there will still be, I think, a significant amount of work to do just in sorting out how the new program will work. And it's not a new program per se. I mean, it's putting funding into the AML Trust Fund. But I think it's possible it'll be at least a little bit different and perhaps even significantly different than the way the usual AML program runs. A lot of that remains to be seen. I have listed some of the most notable provisions here of how the BIF funding would work. So I'll go through those briefly. And to start with, all states and tribes that have a Title IV program, including the certified programs, would be eligible for funding. And their funding would be based on the historic coal formula, which basically means it's going to be based on the proportion of coal mining that happened in each state prior to 1977. And that's an established formula that OSM uses as the basis for part of the regular Title IV grants. So we're all very familiar with that. Each state and tribe will get an equal installment of their portion of the funding over the course of 15 years. And they're supposed to each get a minimum of $20 million over that 15 years. So, and then the other most notable thing I think is, and probably the most unclear thing, is what kinds of activities are covered. The language in the BIF refers to SMACRA Title for Section 403, which covers priorities. And so it's a little strange that it refers to the priority section rather than the section in Title IV that covers what activities are allowed for funding. But I think it's pretty clear that most reclamation work should be covered based on that reference to to Section 403. And certainly the priority system will have to be followed. But I think there's some questions about certain kinds of activities and whether they're allowed or not, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But certainly we're going to have to work with OSM to just sort through how they will interpret some of these ambiguities and just make sure things are running as smoothly as they can. And I think the NGOs will be helpful in that effort. And one other thing that I want to mention as part of this that I think probably will be the most significant impediment to implementation of this funding. I mean, I think it will be successfully implemented, I have no doubt. But one of the difficulties will be that the capacity of the state AML programs is not necessarily right now where it needs to be to contend with this huge increase in funding. And that's a good problem to have, but it could still be a problem. And, it takes time to hire new staff. And the programs tend to be very careful about how much staff they hire. It's based on kind of your certainty about long-term funding. And since every indication was that AML fees would be going down, most states have kept their staff level or maybe even let their staff shrink over time through attrition. And then again, suddenly there's all this new funding. So I think in the short run, we're going to have to try pretty hard to get the FTEs and other resources that are needed to contend with the increase. And for example, I think BAMR's grant in Pennsylvania will about double, which is amazing. And even though they're the biggest AML program in the country, they are expressing concern that it'll be difficult for them to get all the additional employees they need in a timely manner. So I think, again, this is a place where the NGOs could potentially be really helpful, is one among many, is to make the case to the state legislators and budget offices that BAMR needs to get as many employees as it'll take for them to use this money. And then moving on, there are a few other outstanding issues in AML that I alluded to earlier. And these are some of the additional changes that would have been made by the Cartwright bill for reauthorization that did not make it into the BIF. And IMCC has been supportive of these, and I think the Pennsylvania NGOs have been too. So we'll probably want to see these things added to Congress's AML legislative efforts in the future here, in whatever shape that takes. So to briefly go through what these are, I think the first one is emergencies, and so that is emergency AML projects. And so we'd like to change the way that they're funded. Basically, right now, the way they're funded causes problems especially for the smaller programs, but even for states like Pennsylvania, where it's just hard to plan when you know that you're going to have emergencies every year, not exactly sure how expensive they'll be, but you have to provide for that out of your regular AML grant. So it becomes difficult to plan how much regular AML work you can do. So we'd like to go back to the original way these are funded, where it comes from OSM's share of grants and they reimburse the states. And then a second thing relates to sequestration. So we will ask that the future funding be exempted from sequestration. And we actually don't think it was ever really appropriate to sequester this funding in the first place, given that it's a dedicated trust fund and it doesn't come from taxes. But in any case, it was sequestered. And so we're also going to ask that the previously sequestered funding be returned to the states. And I do want to note as an aside that the BIF language for the new funding does include language that would, as far as we can tell, exempt it from sequestration, and that's great. But again, we also want to return the previously sequestered funding. So that will be in the mix. And then thirdly, minimum program states, we want to increase the funding that they get from $3 million to $5 million per year as a minimum. And there's about a dozen of these states. It includes Maryland, which I know is a friend of the Pennsylvania NGOs, and making this change will just make it a lot easier, again, for them to plan, how to make progress with their regular AML projects. And $3 million just isn't quite enough to comfortably make regular progress. And we'd also like to see them able to set money aside in their AMD accounts. So each of those three things, I think, will remain important, but it is, I think, notable that they're probably somewhat less important if the Bi-Partisan Infrastructure money passes, just because it's such a massive increase in funding. The the minimum programs would all get more money, and most would actually get more than 5 million now. The changing in funding, the increase in funding would also mean that changing emergencies and changing sequestration just wouldn't be as impactful because budgets are already swelling. But again, I still think that these are going to be important, and certainly I think we'll be in the mix for AML legislative initiatives after reauthorization. And the biggest one out there, I think, though, is this fix to the BIF related to AMD set aside. And basically the issue here is that we'd like to get clarity on whether AMD set aside accounts are an eligible use of funds under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and also potentially to make a couple other small tweaks to how water treatment projects work. And so basically, it's just not clear in the BIF funding right now whether this is allowed. And to be clear, this is what I mean is the states use trust funds in which they set aside a portion of their AML funding to provide for the long-term operation and maintenance needs. So there's interest generated by the trust fund, and that's a way of making sure you have funding in perpetuity to continue running these water treatment sites. And without that certainty of the long-term funding, it's just not prudent to build a lot of water treatment systems. So it's really a pretty necessary thing. And so noticing that it wasn't totally clear whether that was allowed, IMCC worked with the Pennsylvania NGOs, and we worked with Senator Casey's office to craft an amendment to the BIF that would allow AMD set aside and also do a couple other things. One is change the adjacency rule for priority threes, and also the qualified hydrologic unit rule. Again, just two other things that make water treatment a little bit easier in SMAC Title IV. But that amendment was not included in the BIF. I think, again, mainly just due to the sort of lack of time to have a debate about it. So where we are at this point is we're probably going to see standalone legislation, I think, that will include this AMD fix and potentially some of the other things that I mentioned a moment ago. It's in a little bit of a holding pattern right now just because we're waiting to see what happens with the BIF, but we can all expect that. And one other thing I want to note before I move on from this is that I think there is room potentially for OSM to interpret the BIF language as it currently exists to allow funding for AMD set aside. And the argument we'll make basically is that water treatment clearly is envisioned as being eligible. AMD set aside is a necessary part of doing that work, as I said. And so we can't actually do a part of what Congress clearly intended without AMD set aside. And that's the kind of argument that agencies will often make when they interpret legislation, but it's just not clear if OSM will be amenable to that argument in this case or not. So certainly it would be great to have the clarity provided by the AMD set aside fix, and we'll still be looking to advance that in Congress. So now I think that about covers it for the BIF and reauthorization issues, which were the most important thing to talk about today. But there are a number of other things I want to go into under the heading of economic benefits. And one obvious one is the Reclaim Act, which, to remind everyone, stands for Revitalizing the Economy of Coal Communities by Leveraging Local Activities and Investing More. Basically, what this bill does is draw down $2 billion or so that are in the AML trust fund we talked about earlier, and use that in addition to regular AML grants for AML projects that have a special kind of economic upside. And all AML projects, I think, do have economic benefits, but the idea here is to select them in part based on ones that have special economic upside. And Reclaim had a lot of momentum coming into this Congress. There is a coalition of NGOs that supports the bill, and it's just that much like reauthorization, it was sort of preempted by the BIF. So it's not clear what's going to happen with Reclaim now. I think a big part of the purpose of Reclaim is just accelerating AML funding, and that, of course, is satisfied by the BIF. And there might just be a limited appetite for doing other major AML-related legislation, given that they've just done the BIF AML funding. And I think it's worth noting, too, that, as I was saying, that the state capacity is going to be strained with this massive increase in funding, and it would be even more strained with Reclaim. But that all being said, I still think it's possible that Reclaim is something that's on the table for Congress, and certainly the key motivation of Reclaim, looking through this economic lens at the importance of AML is still very much part of the conversation. And I think that's a big part of why AML was included in this bipartisan infrastructure bill. So it's certainly an important thing, important driver of AML consideration in Congress. And a related thing here to talk about is AMLER, also known as the pilot program. And I think it was called pilot in the sense that it was sort of a test of ideas like reclaim. And that stands for Economic Revitalization Program, Abandoned Mine Lands Economic Revitalization. And this program is still happening, and we expect it to continue indefinitely. There are currently 6 states getting funding through this. The big 3 are getting 25 million. I see I have a typo in my slides where it says 30 million, but that should be 25. And then the next 3 get 15 million per year. And the tribes actually also get money. They get 10 million. So this is also all about the economic upside of AML. And in a sense, even more so than reclaim, because you can spend the money not just on AML reclamation, but on brick and mortar in general. And I think that AMLER is taking on actually increased importance in light of, again, the importance of the economic way of looking at AML, but also specifically with the Biden administration's desire to further environmental justice concerns. And they see AMLER and AML perhaps more generally as being an important part of that. So the administration has this initiative called Justice 40, which basically dictates that 40% of federal investments should go to disadvantaged communities, where that's defined in an environmental justice sense. And AML work really is a prime candidate for that, and it's been identified as such. Given that all of these communities that are impacted by AML have been adversely impacted environmentally and otherwise by energy development. So that's classic environmental justice, a classic environmental justice concern. And so I think probably most places with AML sites could be considered disadvantaged in that sense. But we'll see how it plays out. What specifically will be the kind of changes that are made to AML to contend with or to accommodate Justice 40, I should say. And each agency is expected to do that. And for OSM, certainly it'll be first and foremost the AMLER program. And there's been a lot of good work done on AMLER so far. I think there's a good reason that it's being highlighted. I want to say that it has not been without difficulties, this program. And I think given that the economic dimension of AML work is something that's still relatively new, or at least considering that dimension when you're doing projects is new, it's not surprising that there's been some of that difficulty, but we're still working with OSM to try to sort through how to minimize some of the delays and kind of simplify the process, create more clarity on how this is supposed to work. But again, there's been a lot of really good work done in this program, and it's been a really great way to continue highlighting how important AML is, not just for environment and health, but also for economics. So moving on again, I want to talk a little bit about Good Samaritan liability protections. And the background here basically is that there is concern out there with liability that you can face when you're doing water treatment as part of AML work. That's even if you're a state that's meant to be doing this work, or if you're an NGO, a third party that has no connection to the site, you're just being charitable, you can also face liability here. And what's really pernicious is that you can face liability even if you have done a project that makes things better and the project went off without a hitch, and even if it wasn't actually possible to clean up the site entirely, if there's any remaining pollution, you're liable for it in the long term potentially. And so the result of that specter of liability is that a lot of good work is not being done, or where it is being done, it's being done in a pretty limited fashion. And again, this affects both NGOs and the state AML programs, including Pennsylvania. There is a state level Good Sam law that I think should be a model for the rest of the country, but even with that, the work is more limited than it needs to be that's getting done in Pennsylvania, and it still involves some amount of risk potentially. So I think that there's a lot of desire, certainly at IMCC and in the NGOs, to put protections into place that cover these kinds of circumstances, that give protections to the parties that deserve it. And I think a lot of people agree, most people perhaps, that something like this would be a good idea, but it's just been hard to get agreement in Congress on the details. And so we have not seen Good Sam legislation, even though it's being debated now for, I think we're in the third decade. So anyway, as far as recent developments, the Trump administration did try to make some progress through the EPA on this, and at least through the means they have at their disposal. And basically that came in the form of comfort letters, as they're called, which basically means that EPA gives your organization a letter that says, we don't intend to sue you over the remaining liability at your site if you do a good job. And that is really precious little comfort. They did try, but it's just not within their grasp to provide the level of change that's needed. They really what we need is legislative change to fix this liability issue, and that's not something EPA can provide. So with the legislative effort, our friends at Trout Unlimited have been on the forefront, and they are doing as much as they can, I think, on both the coal and hard rock side. They have been working on the Community Reclamation Partnerships Act, the CRPA, or Community Reclaimers, as it's called sometimes. That is still out there, and they've been trying to get traction for it. It hasn't gotten the critical mass it needs yet, but they're still trying. And that bill certainly has made more progress than past Good Samaritan bills, I think. On the hard rock side, there's been a little bit more promise perhaps recently, in that TU is working on a pilot approach where there would be like 15 or so projects that would be authorized and would get this kind of limited liability protection. So the idea here is just to demonstrate that this works, but without making the kind of lasting change to environmental law that makes some folks nervous. So we're hopeful to see that approach introduced at some point. And it would really be great progress to have that pass, even though it's a limited set of projects. And I think it would focus in the West on hard rock AML probably, but it would still also move the ball forward for coal AML to see these concepts, demonstrated successfully. So good on to you for continuing to fight that good fight, and we hope for the best. And since we're speaking of hard rock AML, the last thing I want to touch on here before I take some questions is the Bi-Partisan Infrastructure Bill includes a bunch of funding for hard rock AML, $1.5 billion in grants to states and tribes, as well as funding for the federal agencies. And this, again, is a really huge deal for the AML world, I think. There's no federal funding or federal program for hard rock like there is for SMACRA, for coal, but there is an immense amount of hard rock AML that's out there. And so IMCC has been in discussion with a big group of states, as well as Department of Interior, about how this new program would look, because there's not a lot of detail in the bill. And one of the things that's come out of those conversations is that there's a lot of hard rock or of AML work out there that is non-coal, but would fall outside of the definition of hard rock as it's usually discussed. And that means a lot of good work wouldn't happen if a strict definition of hard rock is used, which is generally related to locatable minerals in the general mining law. And so DOI now is leaning towards actually using a broader definition that would leave this program open to basically any non-coal AML work. So that means that states like Pennsylvania could see funding for non-coal AML work through this program. And BAMR has been part of the discussions. It remains to be seen how this will work out, but I think that's notable for the Pennsylvania AML world. So that's all I've got for you today. It's, as I said, definitely an exciting time. And I thank you for your time today. And again, thank you all for your efforts at AML advocacy. It's really been important and made a difference. And happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Ryan. That was a very informative presentation. It's definitely been interesting to watch what's going on at the federal level. But I have some questions here for you. The first one is, emergencies aside, how is the fund distribution prioritized? I think they're referring to the 11.3 billion in the BIF, I think.
Okay, yeah, so I think the priority system that's used in Title IV generally will still apply. So it's split into priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3, where priority 1 is like very imminent threats to safety and health. Priority 2 are somewhat less imminent, but still serious threats to safety and health. And then priority 3 generally refers to the things that are not a threat to safety and health immediately. So that's where your environmental work falls. And generally the way it works is that you cannot do priority 3 work before you've completed all of your priority 1 and 2 work, unless the priority 3 project you'd like to do is adjacent to a priority 1 or priority 2 site. So hopefully that wasn't more confusing than helpful, but that basically is how it works. Safety and health are the first priority by law, and then environmental work. But there is a large amount of environmental work that gets done through that adjacency requirement.
All right, I think that cleared things up. We have another question here. Does Reclaim have a pay for yet, or is it still behind in this area?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. We're not as close to the kind of internal discussions about how Reclaim's working with Congress, so I'm not sure about that. But I'm not aware that a pay for was ever uncovered.
Okay. Another question is, if the fix to BIF will be as a standalone bill, do you think that could happen this year, or do you see that moving into next year?
I think it could happen this year, or at least I think a bill could be put out this year. But of course, if BIF takes until December, then probably it'll be into next year. And I think it's kind of a truism that the year before an election, it's a lot harder to have legislation get done. So I still think we'd probably see a bill introduced, but going into next year, the prospects for any bill to actually make it through Congress will be somewhat reduced. Okay,
looks like we have one more question here. What can the NGO AMR community do at this time to further the movement of BIF and/or reauthorization?
Good question. I mean, continuing to make it clear how important AML is in the BIF, certainly that's I think always going to be helpful. I don't think the BIF language is going to change at this point. It won't be reopened. So, and we've all seen at what a high level those conversations are playing out. So probably the more acutely helpful place for NGOs to make a difference is on reauthorization, especially if the BIF doesn't go forward. But also those other things we talked about with the emergency funding and sequestration, and especially the AMD fix. I think getting NGO support on those would be really helpful to put effort behind this. If we see standalone legislation, if that's what happens, to put some more weight behind that, because I do think that the appetite in Congress for doing more AML legislation might be limited. So elevating that standalone bill will be something NGOs can help with. And then, as I think I mentioned, but I'll say again that working at the state legislature level to make sure that the AML programs have the funding they need to contend with the new increase from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, I think would be hugely helpful. And there'll be work to do with OSM and making sure that things run smoothly on things like AMLER. So I think there's a lot of places that NGOs can make a big difference.
Okay, we did get another one. Should we continue to advocate for AMD treatment, active treatment and passive plants as clean water infrastructure projects that can create long-term jobs and investments in our coalfield communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a really important thing to continue highlighting, that, environmental work like water treatment has this huge economic benefit. It is an infrastructure improvement in that sense. And I think, highlighting things in those terms is a big part of why we're seeing AML considered on the level that it's being considered now.
Okay, and I would like to invite attendees that if they're interested in asking Ryan directly any questions that they may have, you could just raise your hands and we'll turn your mic on. But in the meantime, Ryan, I do actually have one question. With the push away from coal and everything and the closures of coal mines and such, have you heard of or know of any discussions as to alternative funding mechanisms for the AML fund or anything like that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I think this Treasury funding through the BIF is really the big change there. Otherwise, I'm not aware of any ideas that have really emerged to replace the AML fee. And again, that was something that, in terms of the long-term prospects for finishing up the AML inventory, that was a big worry. So I think eventually it's going to have to come from Treasury funds. Is probably the reality. I don't know that there's another big source of funding out there that makes sense. But and we weren't sure how willing Congress was going to be to provide a lot of Treasury funding for this purpose. But here we are with $11.3 billion in the BIF. So I think that bodes really well.
All right, thank you for that. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So Ryan, I just want to take this time and thank you very much. We got a lot of comments in the chat box here. So
there's a question. There is one question.
I think Janie. Janie, are you there?
I could see her.
Yeah. Go ahead, Janie. You can speak.
I don't know if she can hear us.
Sorry, I must have missed her question, or
she had her hand up.
Yeah, she had her hand raised.
Oh, apologies. I didn't see that.
Maybe it was an accident. So I guess you can go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, all right. Well, Janie, if you do have a question, I'm sure Ryan would be happy to answer it for you later. But with that, I just thank you again, Ryan. I also want to thank the conference planning committee, especially Ann and Mike, for putting all the sessions together here. Also want to thank all of the attendees. Just want to remind you all to remember to fill out the session feedbacks, especially if you are interested in the PDH hours. So this concludes our sessions for today. Hopefully you can all join us tonight for the social hour from 7 to 9 p.m. If not, hopefully we will see you all again tomorrow. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.